Many iconic people in the history kept journals or diaries. People like Thomas Edison, his journal entries, show that his brain was always working because he wrote about 5 million pages of notes. And people like Winston Churchill, Mark Twain, the famous American author, Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, all these people had journal entries and they maintained journals or diaries. Of course, they are the people of the world. If you go to a therapist, he or she will suggest you to usually start writing a journal or a diary. They will ask us to sit down and think about the 5 things we are grateful about on that particular day and write them in the journal or write them in our diary. That's good, but what is the point I'm trying to make? Keep listening as we talk more about this. I don't know if you have struggled with this problem, but I certainly did, and I do even till today. Now, because we are human beings, we cannot touch God. We cannot see God. Physically, using our 5 senses, we can do nothing. But we are people of emotions, feelings, and senses. And it is so challenging for us not to use these 5 senses and beyond that, because faith is the evidence of things hoped for. It's sometimes difficult to communicate with God. So many times, praying to God or communication with God feels like I'm talking to an imaginary friend. And it is hard to feel and understand that God is actually listening to me. But the Bible tells us in 1 John 5:14 and 15 that God is listening to us, and I believe that with all my heart. But what can we do about this thing? Because we human beings need everything to be tangible. George Mueller is widely considered one of the greatest men of prayer and faith since the days of the New Testament. He lived nearly the entire 19th century, 2/3 of it in Bristol, England. And he led 4 far-reaching influential ministries, but we all know him for his work among the orphans and his orphanages. Now, George Mueller had over 50,000 specific recorded answers to prayers in his journals, 30,000 of which he said were answered the same day or the same hour that he prayed for them. Now, think of it. That's 500 definite answers to prayer each year, more than 1 per day, and every single day for 60 years. How do we know all this? It is because George Mueller took it up to document everything. He wrote down everything. George Mueller had a journal and he had journal entries. There are many men of God all over the world who are encouraged even till today by reading those journal entries of George Mueller. And one of them is Paul Washer. And he says that every time he feels low or discouraged, he goes to the journal of George Mueller and he reads it and finds encouragement and finds comfort seeing how God helped George Mueller in certain situations that he recorded everything. Now, I realized that writing has the power to help me see the beauty of God at work in my life experiences. And when I express my thoughts and feelings in a journal or in a diary, I was surprised by how much I discovered about God in the process. And God did use my journal as a tool to transform me. Because we often forget God's dealings with our lives on day-to-day basis. But here's how writing to God, be it in prayers or expressing my frustrations, writing with gratefulness, all these kind of things, whatever that might be, here's how it helped me. Don Carson says believers who spend no time reviewing and pondering in their minds what God has done, whether they are alone and reading their Bibles or joining with other believers in corporate adoration, should not be surprised if they rarely sense that God is near. Now, journaling is one of the means for us to ponder, think about what God has done, of tangibly recording His unwarranted grace for our lives. This is so true in my life because the words I wrote and when I reread it again, they just helped me understand how faithful God was, and they were haunting reminders of how ungrateful a life I spend not thanking God enough for every little tiny detail and for every prayer that He answers. Because journal serves for us as a reminder of the sanctification process. We all need constant reminders, and we don't become holy overnight, and it takes time and it takes a lot of sweat. Many know of Jonathan Edwards, right? He has written 70 resolutions. Please read those resolutions. And he even recorded his life of highs and lows and how often he had this deep discouragement and defeat. And he also recorded many days of decays and lengthy times of inability to focus on spiritual things, his struggle to focus on the things of God. And in Edwards' diary, we see a glimpse and an honest picture of who Jonathan Edwards was. And I quote from his diary. He says, "I find by experience that let me make resolutions and do what I will. It is all nothing and to no purpose at all without the help of the Spirit of God, without the motions of the Spirit of God." Edwards learned to depend on God's grace, and we can read that through his journal. Journaling, certainly, it serves as a mirror to me because it reminds me of my resolutions. It reminds me of the resolutions that I've made and I've broken. It reminds me of how desperately I need God's enabling grace to obey Him and to honor Him. And without God's help, there is nothing that I can do. So a journal or my journal entries helped me as reminders of the sanctification process in my life. Writing a journal helped me as an aid in my prayer. Now, being focused or staying focused is really a challenging thing for us. Meditative reading can really be difficult, and sitting at a point of time at a particular place and just focusing on a certain thing is truly challenging, especially in our age with all the texts and tweets and posts. It's really difficult because just after reading 2 or 3 pages, my mind just goes all over the place. If I read a book or an article or even the Bible, I need to admit that, I get fidgeting with something, I lose the thread, I begin looking for something else to do. I feel as if I'm always dragging my wayward brain to come back to what I am doing. And the deep reading that used to come naturally has become a struggle for all of us. But I have observed that while I pray or read my Bible, when I journal, note down everything that God speaks to me and what I want to tell God, everything, if I record it step by step, it allowed me to slow down and focus on my thoughts and to unplug and disconnect and pray and meditate on the scriptures because I was thinking, I was writing, and I was talking to God. In other words, God was talking to me and I was responding back to Him, but all that through writing. So journaling has really helped me as an aid in my prayer. John Calvin says it well. He says, "I count myself as one of the number of those who learn as they write and write as they learn." We see that all our reformers, all our missionaries, and many, many men of God recorded and wrote down what they have learned, wrote down what God did in their lives, and wrote down about the ups and downs in their lives. I'm sure it served as a reminder for them of who God was, but also their journals are truly a testimony for us even till today, and we are so encouraged by reading their journal entries. And isn't that wonderful? Out of all the men of God, George Muller's journal really stands out, and it is really close to my heart. So let me read few entries from his journal, and please, I recommend everybody to read George Muller's journal entries. Now, I'm reading from George Muller's journal entries from his diary, and he writes, "My mother died suddenly when I was 14 years old. That night, I played cards until 2 in the morning and went to a tavern the next day. Her death made no lasting impression on me. Instead, I grew worse." So he records everything about how sinful he was. What did he do and how did he waste the money? what happened, how wicked his behavior was. And he records everything, he writes them down for us. Here's another entry that he wrote. In November, I went on a pleasure trip where I spent 6 days in sin. My father discovered my absence before I returned, so I took all the money I could find and went to Brunswick. After spending a week at Brunswick in an expensive hotel, my money was gone. I then went without money to another hotel for a week. At last, the owner of the hotel, suspecting that I had no money, asked for payment and took my best clothes as security. I walked about 6 miles to an inn and began to live as if I had plenty of money. On the third morning, I went quietly out of the yard and ran off. By this time, the innkeeper became suspicious and had me arrested. The police questioned me for about 3 hours and sent me to jail. At the age of 16, I became an inmate of a prison dwelling with thieves and murderers. So he writes about how God rescued him, and he records everything in so much of detail that it really astonishes us that, it is just that grace of God that saves every impossible person. And the amount of work George Muller did and the amount of love he had for God, we can see through his journal entries how he grew closer to God and how God sanctified him, how God nurtured him, and how George Muller started to become a true Christian, walking the true walk of faith. I'm reading another journal entry, June 25th. These last 3 days, I have had very little real communion with God and have therefore been irritable and weak spiritually. June 26th. I rose early this morning and spent nearly 2 hours in prayer before breakfast. I now feel more comfortable. These entries by George Muller, they remind us that God will use ordinary people to do extraordinary things when we have faith in the God who is able to do everything. I read another journal entry, and he says, February 25th, in the name of the Lord and in dependence on Him alone for support, we have established a 5th school for poor children, which opened today. We now have 2 boys' schools and 3 girls' schools. June 25th, our little boy is so ill that I have no hope of his recovery. June 26th, my prayer last evening was that God would support my dear wife under the trial. 2 hours later, the little one went home to be with the Lord. I fully realize that the dear infant is much better off with the Lord Jesus than with us, and when I weep for joy. You see, he recorded everything. We see the ups and downs in his life, the trials they faced in his life. And these are really, really so helpful. And these have been so encouraging to so many believers all over the world. So this year, as we are still in the first month of this new year, why don't you try writing down everything that the Lord is doing in your life? Or write down your prayers, write down your frustrations, write down your expectations, write down your goals, write down not just as a journal entry or like people in the world write it as Dear Diary, but like something that you are recording for yourself so that you would go back and introspect and see and remind yourself of how faithful God was in your life, or even for your family members to read them and be encouraged after you go to be with the Lord. Isn't that a wonderful thought? Why don't you think and give it a try? All you need is a book and a pen and a sound mind to sit down and think about what God is doing in your life and record it. Trust me, it will really help us talk to God in a more personal way because we are physically writing down with a pen on the paper and we are putting words. It's just like writing a letter to someone, and that really helped me a lot. As I close, and as you think to start writing and recording all that God has done in your life and is doing in your life and will do in your life, I want to read my first journal entry, and I hope this will encourage you. This is really personal to me, but I would want to read it to you. And here we go. This is 2019. Dear Lord, I wish I could post this letter to you through a mailbox, But I cannot do that. I may not be able to send it to you physically, but I'm sure you're reading it. In fact, you even know what I am about to write. My Father, I'm tired. I'm broken. I'm shaking. My soul is drying. I'm tired of arguments, hatred, rejection, judgments, legalism, and most of all, my own disease of sin. This world is too harsh. The cold is cutting my flesh and biting and bleeding. The sun is too hot that I cannot stand the heat. The storm is too huge and dark that I cannot see the light. Lord, I know I've been dead in sin, and you came down to me, to this pit, and redeemed my soul. You said I'm worth more than a sparrow. You said I'm the apple of your eye. You said that I'm your daughter. Lord, help me to draw close to you as you take me through this chastening. My life is futile, Lord. I'm reaching the end. Please give me some work to do so that I will be rewarded in heaven for what you have entrusted to me in my hands. Please deliver me from this captivity. Please hear my prayer, Lord. Please help me. P.S. Life and death situation. Attend immediately. Arpana. So that was my first journal entry. And when I look at this entry, and when I read these words, please give me some work to do, Lord. And when I look at my life now, I am amazed at the amount of faithfulness and the amount of goodness of God. So dear Christian, why don't you start recording everything? Write it down. It will really help you. It helped me and it will help you. Try it and see. Because with proper perspective and a right heart before the Lord, journaling is and can be a remarkable thing. Why not give it a try? See you all next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. You were listening to the Arpana Saladi podcast. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.